A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So, we will start with the topics of the day. The first topic we'll be discussing today is related to the UNSC reforms. So, this United Nations being an international organization, and anything that's related to various international organizations, their functioning and their analysis of the functioning is a topic under your GS syllabus too, broadly under the international relations topics. So why is now UNSA reforms again in news? So mostly UNSA reforms is one topic which is every year, almost every year, it is always there in the news. So no matter, you don't even have to think about the fact that it is there in the news, should I prepare the topic or not? So it is one topic that is perennially in news, and you can prepare really well for the topic, and anytime you can expect a question on UN reforms. So, but this year, why is it in news? Is because now United Nations has completed 75 years since its formation. So, because it has completed 75 years of formation, there is a special session that is being held to commemorate or to mark this 75th year of the United Nations formation. So at this juncture, it becomes very important for us to debate upon the relevance of United Nations, whether it has succeeded or failed, and what kind of reforms are needed in the United Nations. In this particular editorial, it begins with a statement that our Prime Minister has given at this special session that is marking the 75 years of the formation of United Nations. So such statements by the Prime Minister, you can use it in the introduction or in the conclusion when you're writing your answers. So what the Prime Minister has said is, when there are outdated structures and without any comprehensive changes made to these outdated structures, the result is there is going to be a crisis of confidence. So essentially, it is outdated structures minus comprehensive changes is equal to crisis of confidence. So whenever even you are making your notes, many of you ask me how to make notes and all that. So you should not write the entire statement what the Prime Minister has actually given. So you just have to write just that outdated structures minus comprehensive changes is equal to crisis of confidence, and you must be in a position to elaborate it, that what the Prime Minister meant was, when we have such outdated structures like the United Nations and we are not making any comprehensive changes depending upon the changes in the world order, then that will only result into crisis of confidence. So this is the statement of the Prime Minister, which can be used in the questions introduction or conclusion. So next is, we must understand why is India also has been for many years now demanding a permanent membership at the United Nations Security Council. So this argument we have even discussed once earlier in one of the previous ICANN videos, where we have discussed the United Nations reforms and why India demands a permanent membership. So one is that India is one of the largest economy and also the fastest growing economy, one of the in South Asia. Second is, India is the second most populous country, and human resource is one of the biggest assets, to say so, in the current world. Third is, we have always been supportive of and we have always promoted the rules-based international order, and our track record in promoting the rules-based international order has been very, very good. So this is a third reason. We have been the largest contributors to the United Nations peacekeeping force, and also the world has changed a lot since the day the United Nations was established. When the United Nations was established after the World War II came to an end, so there were mostly the United Nations Security Council permanent members were those who were the winners in the Second World War. So be it US, UK, France, Russia, and later on, of course, China. But however, the situation now, the world now is completely changed. We have so many developing countries, and we hardly have any representation in the permanent membership from Australia or Africa or South America. So therefore, this whole body, UNSC, is not even representative of the emerging world order, where the developing countries, the emerging economies are doing well. So it is not representative. So these are the 5 important reasons what India has always been putting forward whenever it has been demanding the permanent membership at the United Nations Security Council. So next we'll be seeing is, why is it that we are seeking for reforms now? The first, as we just saw, that United Nations Security Council is not representative of the changing world order. So that time it was the United States and some of the European countries that have been very strong after the World War II came to an end. But now economically and also geopolitically, several other countries in the African continents, in the South America and in South Asia have emerged very, very important as the fast growing economies. So these economies are not represented in the United Nations Security Council. So there is not enough representation, and therefore UNSC is not a representative body that represents every country across the world. So therefore this is one reason why we need reform. Second is there is a deep polarization within the UNSC. So if you go by some of the resolutions, important resolutions that have been introduced in the UNSC, we see that out of the permanent 5 members in the UNSC, there is always a kind of disagreement. So even if one of those countries is going to veto a resolution, then the resolution is going to then reach a deadlock and nothing is going to happen to that resolution. So there is a polarization among these 5 P5 countries itself, the permanent members of the Security Council, and when they disagree, no reforms can actually proceed, no resolution can actually see the light of the day. So this needs to be removed, and we need to have the other countries coming in, and we need to end this polarization among the P5 countries. So this is the second reason why we need reforms. The third is the United Nations as such has not been extremely successful in dealing with so many crises post the Second World War. So even in the recent times, if we see the Israel-Palestine crisis, this has not been resolved by the United Nations. Similarly, the issue related to China and how aggressive it has been with respect to various countries in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So that also United Nations has not been able to solve. Now the corona crisis has happened. The entire world was looking forward towards the United Nations to come out with a solution and give that backbone and support. But again, United Nations has failed in this respect. So there is repeated failures of the United Nations to meet the objectives or the goals for which it was formed after the Second World War. So all of these reasons call for a relook at the way United Nations has been set up and functioning, and we need to think about what kind of reforms we need to introduce in the institution. So next we'll just be looking at what kind of major reforms are needed at the UNSC, or rather the United Nations. So whenever we talk about the reforms of the United Nations, the only thing that we think about is the UNSC reforms and India getting a permanent membership. But UN reforms is not just all about that. So whenever you are talking about reforms in the United Nations, you need to speak under 5 broad categories. So this pentagon that you can see on the slide will give a very good structure to your answer. And it will also show that you have not interpreted the question in very narrow terms. Whenever UN reforms is asked, the content will only and mostly revolve around just the India's membership of UNSC Council. So that is not the everything about UN reforms. So when you're talking about UN reforms, first is that it is about enlarging the United Nations Security Council. So at present, as we know, we have 5 permanent members and some 10 non-permanent members who will keep rotating. But this again, look at the number of countries across the world and the kind of role they play at the international level. But just 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members is not a sufficient number which requires such a representation at such a high level. So therefore we need to enlarge the membership of the United Nations Security Council as such. So this is the first reform that is required. Second is related to the membership categories. So here again we have membership categories like the permanent members, the non-permanent members. Why is there such a distinction? So we need to look into these membership categories. Why are some members given such a privileged position of being permanent members, and while some other members are just non-permanent members who just come and go and who may not be able to contribute significantly to the discussions that happen at UNSC. The third is a veto power. Even when there are non-permanent members and permanent members, why is it that just 5 countries, the permanent members, have the veto power? How is it that just these 5 countries have been given such immense power that they can fail any resolution introduced by any country? If they want to fail it, just one negative vote from any of these 5 members is going to block that particular resolution completely. So this veto power is again something that needs to be questioned, because we believe in an equitable international order, and in such a case, why some certain privileges are to be given to just the 5 permanent members in the form of veto power is something that again needs a relook. The next is a regional representation, which we have sufficiently discussed. That is how various other countries, the African countries, Latin American countries, South Asian countries, they have been growing really well and performing really well on economic front and even otherwise. So their geopolitical importance is also now on the rise. But in spite of that, their representation at the UNSC is not commensurate with their power otherwise. So therefore, this regional representation is one more thing that needs to be looked into. The second is, the last one is the General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council balance. So General Assembly is a body that has all the members, all the countries as members in the General Assembly. But UNSC has at most 15 members, with just 5 being the permanent members. So in such a case, even though General Assembly is a body that has all the countries as the members, relatively UNSC assumes a more powerful position when it comes to passing of any important resolutions. So we also need to relook at this power balance between General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. So these are the 5 important areas where we need to come out with reforms in the United Nations, and UN reforms is just not about the permanent membership of India in the UNSC. So you have to discuss each of these 5 broad categories, which will show that you have a good understanding of what reforms, UN reforms means, and it is not just limited to just 1 or 2 things. So this is about the United Nations and why India is demanding for reforms, what kind of reforms are needed, and everything related to it, and also the Prime Minister's statement, which you can use in the introduction or conclusion. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is the role played by the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, that is SAARC. So SAARC, again being a regional body, and an analysis about SAARC, about relevance of SAARC becomes a part of your GS syllabus too. So in international relations part of your GS2 paper, you may be faced with questions like critically analyze the relevance of SAARC in the current environment, and whether India should continue to have give its support and nourish SAARC, or should it shift its attention to the BIMSTEC or whatever. So you may have some questions related to such analysis. So usually it is advisable that whenever you are answering such questions, don't completely negate the utility of a particular cooperation. So don't say that no, SAARC is extremely irrelevant, there is completely no use of SAARC, and there is nothing good that SAARC is doing, so let's not go with SAARC anymore. So let's rather focus our attention somewhere else. So don't write on such lines, don't conclude on such lines. So rather you will have to show that SAARC is actually very relevant, and it is always important, and it is good for us if we can nourish and we can nurture SAARC and be able to work together in the Indian subcontinent. So that is what is very important. So in that case, whenever you are writing an answer, you will need some fodder, some supporting material or arguments that you will use to say that SAARC is relevant and it is doing good work, and in the future, in the way forward, it can work and collaborate on these areas, which will make it even more relevant. So in that case, one area of cooperation would be the post-COVID-19 world. So all of the SAARC countries, because of the COVID, are facing this health crisis, and there are all of these population have a lot of immigrant population, and poverty is very high in the SAARC region. So people are losing jobs. There is also the economic crisis, the contraction in the economy that is there because of the COVID crisis. So these countries are facing a common problem, and which explains, or which precisely why these countries should be collaborating and cooperating with one another if we want to find a solution to the common problems that the entire region is facing. And for that, SAARC could be a very good forum where these countries can come together and they can cooperate to find a solution to this common problem in the post-COVID-19 world. So for that, recently a couple of months before, the SAARC virtual summit was organized, in which our Prime Minister had pitched in the idea of creating a SAARC COVID-19 fund. So this fund was actually created, and the countries had also shown their willingness to contribute to this particular fund, which could be used for the reason for the entire region to carry out anything that is related to the COVID-19, whether it is related to vaccine development or giving assistance and welfare support to the people who have been affected, whatever it be. So countries had shown their willingness to formation of the SAARC COVID-19 fund. So this is one area where the countries have cooperated. So then what is it that these countries in the future can also do? One is that the SAARC already has an institutional framework of its own. So this institutional framework can be used very effectively to respond to this crisis by all the countries together. So the institutional framework of the SAARC can be used to exchange information, exchange best practices, and whatever it is required to tackle COVID. So this institutional framework can be used effectively to tackle the pandemic. Second is the SAARC food banks are also already there. So these SAARC food banks could again be activated because of the pandemic. The food crisis is also one of the consequences which can happen. So by activating the SAARC food banks, we can prevent such food crises that can happen in the region. So any regional food crisis that can be tackled by activating the SAARC food banks. So this is one more thing that the SAARC countries can do together. Next is the SAARC Finance Forum. So tackling the COVID-19 pandemic will definitely require us to form some economic policy response. So how are we going to allocate our financial resources to fight the pandemic, and how are we going to allocate the financial resources to revive the economy, which is now crippling and contracting? So such economic policy response is required, and the SAARC Finance Forum, through this, the countries can come together, and for the entire region they can formulate a regional economic policy response. So this is another area where the SAARC countries can cooperate. So these you can write as way forward, that in these areas these countries can cooperate. So this will make SAARC more relevant for us, and we can also find out much more and more areas where the countries can cooperate, and to keep the SAARC very, very much relevant. So that is it about SAARC. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is a farmer issue, or the issue related to agriculture, which is if the question is from the point of view of the farmer who forms a vulnerable section of the society, it can come under your GS2 paper. But if it is framed from the agriculture point of view, which is one of the important economic activities, then it will appear in your GS3 paper. So based on which topic, so it can come in either of the two papers. So even yesterday we discussed the three bills that have now been farm-based bills, which have now been introduced and passed in the parliament, and because of which the farmers have been protesting across the country, and they are against the introduction of these bills, because the farmers they are thinking that the government is introducing these bills to slowly corporatize agriculture and eventually withdraw the minimum support price and the procurement that the government is doing. So because of this fear and insecurity, the farmers are now protesting against the introduction of these bills. So in this context, when these bills were actually ordinances, we had already discussed the important features of these ordinances and what the government sought to achieve when it actually when we were discussing about the Atmanirbhar Bharat and what the package had for the agricultural sector. We had already discussed the important provisions or important points what these bills seek to achieve. So today we'll just have a brief relook at what these bills are actually aiming for. So first is earlier the farmer could sell his or her produce to the mandi, to the nearest mandi, which the mandi that was registered with the APMC Act. So those mandi only the farmer could sell. But now with the bill that has been introduced, it provides a barrier-free environment for the farmer to trade, where the farmer can not just trade in any of the markets within his or her state, but the farmer can also trade and sell his or her produce to any market anywhere in the country. So it is basically providing a barrier-free interstate and intrastate trade and commerce of agricultural produce. So that is the first thing. Second is these bills are also promoting and encouraging contract farming between the farmers and the sponsors. So for which the bills are also providing for a legal framework which will have that is an agreement, farming agreements, which will be entered into by the farmer on the one hand and the sponsor on the other hand, where the sponsor will promise that the sponsor is going to buy from the farmer x quantities of produce after maybe 1 year or after one cropping season at say y rupees per so whatever it is. So there is the farmer at the beginning of sowing itself is has that clarity in mind that his or her produced when it is harvested tomorrow is going to be for sure sold, so it is going to be procured by the sponsor. So the farmer will have a confidence that his or her produce is going to be sold tomorrow, and he or she will also get the right price for that. So this confidence is there among the farmers, because nowadays when the farmers harvest, they hardly wait for the prices to increase or whatever, because they will get engaged in distress sale. So there is a lot of distress sale of the agricultural produce soon after it is harvested. So these farming agreements will prevent such distress sale, because the farmers beforehand itself know that their harvest is going to be taken by the sponsor at a predetermined price. So they are emotionally and psychologically they are free because of this. And also these framing farming agreements, through this even the sponsor will provide the farmer with the technological any technological help that is required by the farmer, and also quality inputs to the farmer, say the quality seeds and quality fertilizers are going to be provided by the sponsor to the farmers, so that there is a uniform standard or quality produce that the farmer can harvest. So such facility is also available to the farmers through the sponsors. However, these acts also have some built-in safeguards such that the sponsors or anybody does not misuse the farmers and the farmers land. So there are some built-in safeguards. So for example, if the farmer owes any amount of money to the sponsor cannot recover that money by taking control of the farmer's land. So the farmer's land will be safe even if he owes something to the sponsor. The sponsor cannot recover his whatever amount is due from the farmer by taking control of the farmer's land. So the farmer's land cannot be taken away by the sponsor, cannot be given on lease or mortgaged. So the farmer's land is going to be safe. So like that, there are built-in safeguards in these bills which will protect the farmer. Next is the dispute resolution. So in case of any disputes also, there is a mechanism for dispute resolution in the form of conciliation board. So this conciliation board is going to be set up by the subdivisional magistrate or SDM, and any issue between the sponsor and the farmer, they can go to this conciliation board set up by the SDM, and they can get their grievances or issues redressed. So these are some of the protections and the positive points that have been pointed out in these bills, which you should point out, because if you have a question like these farmers are protesting, so some bills have been introduced which is against the interest of the farmers, which is actually corporatizing agriculture. So you must have some points to tell that no, it is not, it is actually good for the farmers too. So these are some of those points which you can mention in your answers to show that the bills have pro-farmer provisions as well. So this is about next is in Indian Express, under the explained article, there was some very good data related to agriculture sector, so which you can put them all these kind of data together so that you can revise them. So first is, let's look at this all India, how many farmers are actually under the debt crisis, or how many of them are indebted. We know how the farmer suicides have been on an increase in the last couple of years, and one of the reasons for such increase in the suicides is also said to be the increased indebtedness of the farmers. So the farm households which are indebted is nearly 52% is the all India average. So nearly 52% of the farming households across India, they owe a debt which they need to clear. So this shows the prevalence of high indebtedness among the farmers. And if you talk about the monthly income of the farmers per farm household, then the all India average is just 6,426 rupees per month. So this is very low income, and even a NABARD study on this also held the same thing, which is the nearly 6,000 as the monthly income of the farming households. So that is why the government had also come out with a plan to increase or to double the income of the farmers by 2022 based on the recommendations of Ashok Dalwai committee. So this is the average monthly household income of the farm household. The next important data is you have to know how much proportion of our population is engaged in the agriculture. In 1951, it was 70% of the population was engaged in agriculture, and in 2011, it was 55% of the population that was engaged in agriculture. So, though there is a reduction in the proportion of population engaged in agriculture, there is a lot more reduction in terms of the how much agriculture is contributing to the economy. So now agriculture is contributing to just nearly 16.5% of our GDP. So this has fallen. This you must know. And the next important thing is farming has now not is not a remunerative activity. So people are migrating from their villages and in search of attractive jobs in the urban areas. Farmers are quitting farming and they are moving towards urban areas in search of jobs. So this is a figure related to the migration outside of the farming. So Uttar Pradesh itself has a migration farmers, nearly 1.3 crores farmers who are quitting farming and they are moving towards urban areas in search of better jobs. For Bihar, this figure is nearly 80 lakhs, and Rajasthan it's nearly 40 lakhs. So that is the level of out migration of farmers, and they are quitting farming because farming has become a very risky and a non-remunerative enterprise. The next important data is after the agricultural produce is harvested, so how much of value addition is being done on this agricultural produce? That is how much amount of food processing happens in India. So this way of representation is very good, which you can replicate in your answers rather than quoting the data in the form of sentences. Whenever you quote data in the form of such graphs and figures, graphs and pictures, it is always better because it is very more clear to understand. So India just processes the share of food processing gross value added in the total manufacturing gross value added. For India, it is just 9.7%, while look at for Indonesia and New Zealand, it is as high as 35.5% and 34%. Even USA is doing much better at 11.5%, but India's food processing GVA share in the total manufacturing GVA is just 9.7%. So this data also comes from the Agriculture Statistics at Glance 2019 report and the census report. So these are some of the important data related to agriculture, which you can note them together for the agriculture topic. Like that, for every topic you must have all the data put together, so that for each topic you have every data related to that topic under the same head, and you don't have to search anywhere else for any other data. Everything must be put together. So now let's move on to the next topic. This is the last topic for the day, which is a topic that is related to welfare or developmental issues. So you may face this in your GS2 syllabus when you are discussing about the welfare measures, or you may also face it in your GS3 syllabus where you're talking about inclusive growth, growth versus development, green growth, that is something related to environment and all that. You may also find this as a part of your GS4 syllabus because this has got something to do with the ethical part, because it is not always about measuring the growth of a country in terms of the monetary strengths of the country. So it is also about the smaller pleasures. So therefore it can come as a part of your GS4 syllabus as well, because while I wrote the exam, in fact the first question itself was, what does happiness mean to you? So how do you see happiness? So these are some of the simple questions that are usually asked in GS4. So this may also figure in your GS4 paper. So this is about the World Happiness Report, and so this World Happiness Report 2020 was recently released, in which 156 countries have been ranked on the in the order of their happiness of their citizens. So how happiness is measured by this report, and these are the indicators which are used to measure the happiness of the population in the countries, in these 156 countries, and these parameters can become a very important question for your prelims as well, that you may have a question: which of the following are considered while ranking the countries by the World Happiness Report 2020? So you must know the what are all the bases upon which the countries are ranked. So one is a healthy life expectancy, then the income of these countries, social support, that social safety net that is offered to the citizens, freedom, trust and generosity. So these are the important indicators which are used while ranking the countries in the World Happiness Index or Report 2020. So now what happens is, earlier there was an assumption that the gross domestic product, so higher the GDP, the more happier are its citizens, because they have more income at their hands, so they can buy whatever they want. So this gives a mental satisfaction and peace to the people. But it was observed that even in those countries that were very wealthy and rich, the crime rates were huge, people were more lonely and depressed. So it was understood widely that just economic prosperity does not mean that people are happy. So in this case, in the recent report that was released, Finland has topped this list, and Finland is said to be the most happiest country in the world. So even though United States and other countries are so much rich compared to Finland, but Finland has stopped because of the social safety net that it has provided to the people, and the personal freedom that people enjoy, and also the work-life balance that people enjoy in Finland. So these are some of the important metrics that determines the happiness of people, and it is not always about your income and salary. So when we started realizing that people in these wealthy countries are also very lonely and depressed, and they suffer from various diseases and disorders, and also there is in spite of such a huge wealth, there are crime rates which are high in these countries, it was understood that happiness is something else and it comes from something else. So in this journey, Bhutan was the first in 1979. It introduced the gross national happiness, where it measures the level of happiness among its citizens. Rather than the gross domestic product, Bhutan has gross national happiness. So that gives importance to the environmental conservation. It gives importance to the religious aspect of the people also, because the religious identity is very important for people's happiness. So all of these are given importance in the gross national happiness. Next, this was even recognized by the United Nations, and March 20th was fixed as the International Day of Happiness. Since 2011, the United Nations has recognized this, and later on came the various other initiatives that actually show how much important happiness is. So there is what is called as the Happiness Foundation International. So this Happiness Foundation International also conducts workshops across schools, and tells how important happiness is, and happiness is what we must strive for, and not increasing wealth and income. So then Delhi government also started happiness classes for the Delhi schools. Then recently Gujarat University has started a certificate course in happiness counseling also. So that is one of the development. Madhya Pradesh has started with a separate department, which is the Department of Happiness. And this department is also organizing many happiness camps, which is actually helping create that positive outlook towards this. And Andhra Pradesh has come out with a happiness index itself to measure the development in the state. So these are the various developments when we talk about the importance happiness has been given, and how it is important to move away from the metrics like GDP to measure the overall well-being of the population. We have to come towards various other indicators like SDG, like happiness index, and like social security index, and various others that actually give a true picture of the happiness among the population. So this is about today. These were the other articles that either weren't important from the exam point of view, or were just a repetition of the previous topics. So that is it for today. Have a great day. Thank you.